Hello YouTube, this is Ray and I'm going to show you how I'm getting nearly a perfect 30 frames per second at 4K resolution on Baldur's Gate 3. And if you've seen my last performance video, most of those settings still stands except for 3 major changes that changed the game for me literally. And in order to make this guide as flexible as possible for all the type of Macs that are out there that can play this game, I'm going to try to break this down from the very beginning so that anybody can achieve whatever frame rate they can based on whatever Mac they have currently. Now for my example, I'm using an M1 Max with 64 gigabytes. This thing is pretty much maxed out. You need a Mac with at least 16 gigabytes of memory so that it can handle everything properly for this kind of performance. The 8 gigabyte Mac is really going to struggle, so you're gonna have to make even more sacrifices that I probably can't explain because I would need to have one of those in my hands. Now, in order to understand where your Mac is at, you're going to need to activate the Metal HUD, and that is actually a very easy thing to do on the Mac. You can easily Google it, but I will show you exactly the command you can run on terminal. And there are a few ways to actually do this, but for me, the easiest command is just having launch control, set environment, Metal HUD enabled 1. And you can see it on the screen. You can pause the video right here, stop, and copy that onto your terminal. This is going to activate the Metal HUD for you anytime you use any application that uses Metal. This is going to be our source of truth on understanding the frames per second, the pre and the GPU, and I will explain all 3 of those once we get into the game itself. Please note that this HUD is only available for Mac OS Ventura and above, so make sure you're at least on that OS platform. Now at this point, it's very important to determine what kind of game player you're going to be. I highly recommend you either choose playing in 60 FPS, and we would consider that performance mode, or playing in 30 FPS, which we will consider quality mode. So we're basically going to adapt the same kind of structure the PS5 has. It's important to have these numbers because it's going to determine a few things on how you deal with resolution and deal with FSR. Also, things I will explain in this video. So let's get started. Okay, now that we're at the game and we have our Metal HUD up, there are a few things that you actually do need to know with this Metal HUD in order for it to make sense. The first indicator that you need to know is the frames per second. Everybody pretty much is familiar with frames per second. This is determining how fast the frames can be rendered on the computer currently. And if you're not at your target frames per second, you're really going to notice that. Now, before we move into the pre and the GPU numbers here, you do have to have a goal in mind. You either want to be 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second in this game. Unless you have a very powerful computer that can go beyond that and a monitor that can go beyond that, I highly recommend just sticking with those frames per second. If you want higher fidelity and graphics, choose 30 frames per second. But if you want better performance and a smoother gameplay, choose 60 frames per second. I am actually going to go through both of them. With all of that said, let's start talking about the pre and the GPU numbers here. So the pre stands for present to present interval. This determines how long it is taking one actual frame to be drawn on your computer. It is taking 30 milliseconds for a full frame to render and be displayed on the computer, which is why my frames per second is at 24. There is a calculation for this. But for the sake of math, if you are targeting 60 frames per second, you want your pre to be 16.67 milliseconds max. And if you're targeting 30 frames per second, you want double that. You want 33.34 milliseconds max. As for the GPU number is representing the milliseconds it takes for the GPU to process a task. In an ideal world, you want your GPU to be a bit lower than your pre. When your GPU milliseconds is lower than your pre, that means it's working faster than the presented interval needed in order to render a frame. That is the ideal scenario. In a 60 frames per second case, you really want your GPU to process tasks faster than 16.67. And for the 30 frames per second, you want it to process faster than 33.4 milliseconds. Now, back to this game. I highly recommend you find a spot in the game that has the biggest graphical bottleneck possible. If you are in Act 3, go to Act 3. Everybody has witnessed the frame drops there. Do your testing there. If you are not at Act 3 yet, like me, I highly recommend finding a place which has a lot of daylight because it casts shadows in the game, which also causes a lot of rendering issues. Also, talk to a companion or an NPC and keep it there, because this is actually the biggest bottleneck in the game. And as you can see, my frames per second dropped dramatically to 18. The pre and GPU shot all the way to 53, 54 milliseconds, and that is bad performance. You can also see the pre and GPU graph below, and it's scattered all up and down. That's because some frames can render. That's the frames that are shown to the monitor, but some are actually dropped. So once you reach your bottleneck, I think one of the greatest things in this game is that you can pause at any point, even though nothing is actually paused, and you can actually edit your video settings from there. So for me, I'm going to keep this talking to Volo, and I'm going to edit the video settings right now. My first target, I'm going to try to achieve 60 frames per second performance mode. So in order to do that, we need to set some baseline levels to make it easy. The first thing I would do, change your resolution to the native resolution of your monitor. Just start there. I know it might be slow and sluggish, but it's a good start, because once you get into FSR, which is upscaling, you don't actually want to do both of these at the same time, because it's actually going to be hard to monitor what frames per second you're getting by changing just small minor things. So get your resolution to max, and most importantly, and I think this is probably the most important thing for this game, set your VSync to triple buffer and set your frame rate cap to whatever your target is. According to the developer who worked on the port for this game for the Mac, these settings were necessary in order to do performance and development on the Mac itself. They used triple buffering, and also telling the game what your frame rate cap is helps the game not perform more tasks than it needs to based off your desired frame rate. So for me, I'm going to put this at 60 and the frame rate cap there. Next, put the FSR in performance mode. It's the worst mode there, but there is a reason why we're going to scale up into this. But as of right now, we need to find a good baseline for frames per second. Okay. As for quality, these are subjective, but I highly recommend doing the following. Set the shadow to either medium or low. From high to medium has the biggest percentage increase of frames per second. Medium to low, it's a bit smaller, but it's useful if you do not have a powerful computer. You can also change the model quality from high to medium. If you are talking to an NPC, you will not see this change until you move around the world. This is one of those things that it will only be visible once you start moving around, because when you're moving around, you see more models, which means there are more geometrical shapes on the screen. The last setting I recommend you change is subsurface scattering, as it reads, simulates light scattering underneath object surfaces, creating a more realistic look. The main problem with this setting is that you do not look underneath objects very often. So there's actually very little need for this setting, and it only is just causing a bit of a bottleneck without too much of a noticeable difference in the game visually. So with all of those set, we are currently at 45 frames per second, and that's because our pre is still above 16.67. So at this point, for my computer, the only other option to get the frames that I need is to drop the resolution. So that at this point, I'm going to just drop it from 4K until I get the FPS I need. And now we're at 1440p. basically 2K, and now my frames per second is at 60. Notice that the pre is also at 16.67, and it should basically be there steadily, especially if you have triple buffering on. And as for the GPU, as you can tell, it's under 16.67, and this is the bottleneck point. So currently, I think this is at a good state where 60 frames per second actually works, because once I get out of this talk scene, it should drop to, there it is. It drops to 13 and 12 frames per second. Now, obviously, it doesn't look as good as you would want it to look, but this is the cost of 60 frames per second. So now that you got the FPS to a steady state, this is going to be your baseline high for resolution. Now, the only thing you can adjust and play with here is increasing your FSR and then lowering your resolution at the same time. At least you know your max resolution necessary for 60 frames per second. So if you want to play around with the FSR and reducing the resolution to get the right picture quality, this is the perfect time to do so. Now, to target 30 frames per second, which is what I actually recommend for this game, considering it's not fast, we are going to basically start the same process over again. Let's put this in performance mode. Let's put the resolution all the way back up. And if you notice for me, I'm already at 45 frames per second, which means amazing things for quality changes that we can make. So this is currently the quality at 60 frames per second. Let's change the frame rate to 30. Sometimes it doesn't show or update. Okay, there it is. Now, 30 frames per second. If you can see the graph is very steady right now. The pre is at 33.34. It's trying to stay steady around there. The GPU is well below 33.34. That means the GPU can draw faster than the buffer needed in order to render 30 frames per second. This is a great thing because as you can see, we're still at the same graphical fidelity, but now I can increase the FSR. And what I would do at this point is increase it until I get relatively close to the pre. Not too much to the pre, but close enough so that it doesn't do this. Once the GPU is out of sync with the pre, it's going to be unstable, and this is what it does. So at least in my setting, quality is pretty close to perfect. And now the game looks amazing. And even outside that, the game looks awesome. The GPU's at low. And to me, this is kind of like the perfect setup for 30 frames per second. Because now I have a really great looking game at 4K resolution just because I had the patience to put the frame rate down to 30 frames per second, which means I can increase the upscaler to quality mode, which definitely beats the PlayStation 5. This resolution beats quality mode on the PlayStation 5 by far. So to wrap things up, what I recommend is choosing a target frames per second. I recommend staying at 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second with the obvious recommendation on 30 frames per second. If you do want 60 frames per second, make sure your pre is at 16.67 and no higher than that, or just touching it, and your GPU is lower than your pre. If you want 30 frames per second, make sure your pre is at 33.34 and make sure your GPU is below that. This is how you get great video settings for Baldur's Gate 3 or any game that runs on Mac with Metal. I hope you enjoyed this. Go out there and make the performance of your game look as great as the game itself, and I'll see you in another video. Peace.